Hi, everyone.
Hi, folks. We're in John Wesley Bready, Chapter 2, Blind Guides. He's dealt with the triple tragedies of the expulsion of the Puritans and the other high church clergy who were serious men, but they're not there anymore. So the soft middle is the blind guides of Chapter 2. And that's the state of the church in the early 18th century. He starts with two quotes. Sir Charles Petrie, in his work The Four Georges, and Geoffrey Chaucer, author of Canterbury Tales. And Petrie says about this era, the Church of England was at its nadir during the reigns of the first two Georges and during the early years of George III. Convocation remained silenced, and ecclesiastical preferments invariably made to serve political ends were regarded by clergy and laity alike as little more than desirable offices. Bishoprics and deaneries were solicited from the Prime Minister of the day with unblushing importunity. In other words, the church was utterly corrupt. And Chaucer had said about an earlier time in church history, a few hundred years before this, "If gold roost, what shall iron do?" So the church had had lots of ups and downs in the centuries up till 1700, and this was definitely one of the downs. So the chapter begins, Blind Guides.
Nowhere, perhaps, are the sorry effects of this triple tragedies more unmistakably mirrored than in the succession of the 18th century Archbishops of Canterbury, who, as Primates of all England, directed the destiny of the national church. For during no other century of English history have those commissioned as the Apostolic Fathers and chief shepherds of the fold of Christ represented so low a standard of spiritual discernment as characterized the lives of the 18th century Primates. A running review of these ecclesiastical pilots is essential to an understanding of the wider issues our study involves.
So Bready begins his review of these Archbishops of Canterbury during this two-generation period. The subhead is the 18th century Primates. Thomas Tennyson, Primate from 1694 to 1715, who crowned both Anne and George I, was a pronounced political partisan and a favorite at court. John Potter, 1737 to 47, primate at the time of Wesley's conversion and during the earliest pioneering period of the great evangelical revival, is described by A.W. Rowden in his detailed treatise Primates of the Four Georges as, quote, stilted and starchy, unquote. Though the possessor of some scholarship, he failed utterly to understand the needs of his age. He loathed the new manifestation of religious enthusiasm, as he called it, among the, quote, lower orders of society, unquote. But true to the fashion of the ruling class into which he, as a draper's son, had been lifted, he left behind him £90,000, which he had saved out of the church, a sum equivalent to £200,000 today, that is around 1940. And that would be more like £2 million now. Mm-hmm. Potter's successor, Thomas Herring, 1747 to 57, was, quote, less worthy than he, unquote. John Moore, 1783 to 1805, primate when Wesley felt compelled to take the epical step of ordaining Dr. Coke to superintend the rapidly growing societies, that is Methodist societies, in America, and also during the vital years of the French Revolution, was a confirmed place hunter, the most sordid ecclesiastical nepotist of his nepotic century. Frederick Cornwallis, who was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1768 to 83, primate during the whole of the American Revolutionary War, was seventh son of the fourth Lord Cornwallis. He also was brother to the first Earl Cornwallis and uncle to the first Marquis, the second in command of British troops against the American colonists. On the evidence of Canon Parry in his History of the English Church, Archbishop Cornwallis, quote, appears to have had no churchmanlike scruples, and was simply of the character of a great nobleman about the court. End of quote. Matthew Hutton, who was Archbishop from 1757 to 58, a constant victim of gout, on attaining the apple of his eye, I guess his office, expresses with characteristic fawning his gratitude to Lord Newcastle, quote, who brought me into the view of the world and has led me by the hand to what I am now arrived at. End of quote. Dr. Pyle, a royal chaplain, in a letter written in 1758, says Hutton, quote, died in time for his character, for he was grown covetous and imperious to excess. He left £50,000, which he had saved out of the church in 12 years, and not one penny to any good use or public charity. End of quote.
By the most charitable judgment, only 2 18th century primates were even half worthy of their sacred office. These were William Wake, 1716 to 37, and Thomas Secker, 1758 to 68. The latter, a kindly, scholarly prelate, awakened sufficiently to the needs of his age to warn his clergy that they were losing much ground by not preaching in a manner sufficiently evangelical. But he himself was too much victimized by the frigid rationalism dominating superior society to offer any real guidance along the road of deliverance. Wake, whom Rowden considers the most worthy of 18th century primates, or rather the least unworthy, was a man of some gifts, but it is significant that in later life he spent much time in preparing a treatise on the antiquity, honor, and estate of the name and family of Wake, wherein he strove to establish his family a royal affinity. Paradoxically, though by the middle of the century, a mighty movement was stirring in the deeps beneath, though hundreds of humble parsons and thousands of twice-born laymen were now experiencing the power of true Christianity. Yet so firm was the grip of material and rationalistic forces on the highest offices of the national church, and so bitter the resentment against the tide of religious enthusiasm, that it was reserved to the latter decades of Wesley's crusade to witness the lowest degradation to which the primacy fell. Cornwallis and Moore, therefore, must be recalled as personal witnesses, and their own mouths must be judged by their own mouths.
A glimpse at the manner in which Cornwallis mounted to the highest ecclesiastical office is revealed in his correspondence. On September the 26th, 1759, as Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry, he wrote to Lord Newcastle, then Prime Minister, thus, quote, having been informed that the Bishop of Worcester is in such a bad state of health that in all likelihood he cannot hold out much longer, I hope your Grace will pardon my troubling you with this, barely to mention, without importuning, that a removal to that see would of all others be most agreeable to me. Your Grace's most obliged and obedient humble servant. Reminding you of a certain character in Charles Dickens, right?
Yeah, I'm humble, I am.
Your Grace's most obliged and most obedient humble servant. And then he signs off. So Cornwallis, just one of many who obviously was not a man of the Spirit, but was in the highest place. So if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you read this kind of stuff, you think, oh yeah, well there you go.
Yeah,
dead church, corrupt church.
Yeah.
This is not the church of Jesus Christ. And yet, all it reminds me of is the Old Testament, where you have generation after generation, sometimes for a century.
Of
or
poor
more.
shepherds. But that still leaves the flock.
Yeah.
So we can't forget that there were humble people
Yeah.
underneath them that might have been striving their best to do what they could without good teaching and good shepherds.
And there's a large portion of the evangelical church who kind of looks at all of this as dead church too. And God is not at work. Well, there were sheep here.
Yeah.
Just like there were sheep in the Old Testament, God kept raising up not only good prophets to address the issue from Israel, the people of God, but also good princes and good priests. So there were good men of God. They were always a remnant, but they were always there. And during this period, what's going on?
During the down periods, God is usually preparing someone down the line to take up the slack. So in this case, you've got Susanna Wesley having lots of kids.
Was it 20?
18, I think.
18, yeah.
But that's plenty. And the last two end up being enormously used by God in the
And
church.
the next generation. So John and Charles Wesley are being nurtured at this very moment,
Yeah,
when the
prepared
church is
and
at
nurtured.
its nadir.
And if
Yeah.
you read about her bio, they were being nurtured.
They
I mean,
sure-
she was a homeschooler, all her kids, and she spent time with all of them, some private time with all of them, to nurture them.
Yeah. And so the Puritan tradition didn't die out. It just went under the surface for a while during this very period. Susanna Wesley, the mother of two of the greatest saints of the 18th century who changed the world, right? So we'll put a link into this very principle of when God sets his standard on earth, does he ever let it fade away completely? So in Israel, no. He raised up prophets and others to restore his people at the needed moment, and here he's doing it again. So what about the Church of Jesus Christ? Will it ever be victim of a universal apostasy? And of course, it's not just cults who say yes to that. There's lots of churches who believe they're restoring true worship to this earth.
And if you parachute in only in select places, you make a case for yourself.
Of course you
But
do.
it's not giving you the full picture.
So we'll put a link on to, did Christ predict the universal apostasy? The parable of the sower and the wheat and the weeds. What did Christ actually predict would happen after he left the earth and the apostles died? And also, at the very same time as Susanna Wesley is raising her sons and daughters to this glorious Methodist future, Jonathan Edwards is being born and nurtured in America to do much the same work over there. So we'll put a link into a video we did about another man who's ignored by people like Jehovah's Witnesses. Doesn't fit the narrative. A great man of God of 100 years before Charles Taze Russell, Jonathan Edwards.